Are you working with a narcissistic or controlling leader? Have you tried to confront moral issues in your senior leader only to be shut down or even shunned? Are you experiencing gaslighting, intense criticism, or shame from those higher up in the church? If so, this video is for you. I'm Sean Nemecek, the West Michigan Regional Director for PIR Ministries and author of The Weary Leader's Guide to Burnout. I invited my friend, Dr. Chuck DeGroat, to join me for a conversation around these issues. Dr. DeGroat is a professor of counseling and Christian spirituality at Western Theological Seminary and a faculty member at the Soul Care Institute. He's a licensed therapist, a spiritual director, and an author of several books, including When Narcissism Comes to Church, Wholeheartedness, and The Toughest People to Love. As a therapist, he specializes in issues of abuse and trauma and pastoral or leadership health. Here's my conversation with Chuck DeGroat. Well, Chuck DeGroat, thanks for joining me today. It's good to see you, my friend.
Yeah, it's good to see you too.
I thought we'd just sit down and have a conversation for leaders who are in larger churches and find themselves working under a narcissistic or controlling leader. I've had several of these types of leaders reach out to me just in the last few months, and I'm finding they kind of fall into two different categories of people. One is a leader who has just taken a new job, and he gets there and he finds out that he was not told the truth about his job. Things change, whether it's the amount of pay, the job responsibilities, the relationship with the senior pastor, just all sorts of gaslighting, complaining, criticism, very negative spirit, and wonders, why did I even take this job?
Mm-hmm.
The other scenario that I'm seeing, and this one I see a little bit more often, is somebody who's been serving under a very charismatic leader for some period of time, and they start to see some things that are troubling, whether they be sinful patterns or criticism or anger or foul language or abuse or any number of character issues. And then they start to address those very gently, carefully with their senior leader, hoping to bring health. And the senior leader turns on them, just responds to that by circling the wagons, getting the leadership team around and targeting this other leader, this younger or second-tier leader. And to such an extent that their reputation is tarnished in the church and in the community, and they're driven out, and it's just a lot of pain. Have you seen things like this?
Never. I'm not sure what you're talking about. Are you making this up, Sean? I mean, where are you getting this? I mean, I think in your work and in my work, we're probably hearing these stories a lot more than others. Although, if you're dialed in any way to social media or to some of the podcasts, most notably like the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, right? Mm-hmm. You're aware. I mean, I do run across people at times who are like, that really happens? Like, because I did some writing on this, and largely out of the work that I've done over the last 20 years. And I think probably in the first 10 years or so of my work, particularly within the church planning world, there was a lot of denial around
Mm-hmm.
these things. Now it's interesting. So now we have more language for narcissism, abuse, spiritual abuse, manipulation, gaslighting, things like this, right? But I think at the same time, I'm beginning to see a pendulum swing. We're talking a lot about these kinds of things, and even of late, I've been as I've worked with different networks and churches and denominations, beginning to help them understand at times the difference between bad leadership and abusive leadership, right?
Yeah.
There is a difference, right? And so, but the good news is that we're more aware, and that there are safe places like sitting with Sean to talk about these kinds of things.
Yeah. So my question often is this person really sitting under a narcissistic leader? Do they just have a bad relationship with this leader that's kind of gone sour?
Yeah.
Is this leader just immature and unable to handle criticism? How do you delineate between those different things?
Yeah, one of the reasons I did some writing on this is because I think probably like you with burnout. I mean, we use these words somewhat haphazardly at times,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
you have a bad day, and you're like, I'm so burned out. Um, and it's important to get clear about what we're talking about. And I think with narcissism, it's not merely a sort of a binary, like she's a narcissist, but he's not. There is a spectrum, and
Mhm.
psychologically speaking, there's a psychology here, a history here, in terms of how we understand narcissism, how we test and assess for narcissism, and oftentimes, I mean, I think if someone experiences the sting of maybe a leader who's a bit of a bully or a big personality, we're quick to say, well, he's a narcissist. Those of us who do the work are a little bit slower to name it.
Mhm.
You know, I do a ton of assessments. I mean, I've done hundreds and hundreds of psych assessments over many years, pastors and church planters. And I would say that a good number of the pastors and planters that I see are on a spectrum within what we call cluster B personality disorders, which
Mhm.
includes narcissism, histrionic personality, borderline personality, turbulent personality. Um, but a smaller number elevate all the way up to narcissistic personality disorder, and those are the ones that you experience as completely unself-aware, resistant, unwilling to engage conversation. So there may be, I think, by and large, what probably you and I deal with a lot are people in churches where there are pastors with narcissistic tendencies or a
Yeah.
narcissistic type, but maybe not elevated all the way up to the personality disorder, but you're still experiencing the sting. And I don't want to minimize that either, right?
Right. Exactly. So, for these leaders who are starting to address some of the problems or see some of the problems in their senior leader, and then that leader turns it back on them and makes them the
Yeah.
enemy. That can be damaging not just to that person but to their whole family,
Yeah.
and it can be fairly traumatic. Or is trauma too big of a term there?
Yeah, yeah, it can be traumatizing for sure. I had a very hard ending about 20 years ago, a story that I don't talk about very much, but where I sensed that I was a lot younger then, and I should have been under good care, but I wasn't.
Yeah.
I should have been in therapy, but I wasn't, and I was reactive. And I sort of had it out with a senior leader that I was under, and called him narcissistic. And one of the things I learned through that experience is whether he was narcissistic or not, I had been experiencing trauma within that situation, that context, for a
Mhm.
number of different reasons. And oftentimes, I think we get sort of fixated on the leader, what's wrong with the leader, when I think the first thing that we need to do is get our own care. I think it's really helpful to get with a therapist who is trauma informed and who understands some of these dynamics, and simply begin to do the work yourself so that you can begin to make good choices, not from a place of reactivity like I did. And I paid for it. I lost my job, and Sarah and I really struggled over the next year in particular. We had to live with some friends. I mean, it was a tough situation. Not because I was reading the situation completely inaccurately, but because I was responding out of my own reactivity.
Mhm.
And so my counsel is always to maybe be a bit slower to name something as narcissism, and be quicker to doing your own work, so that you can make the right decision. And if something needs to be said or someone needs to be confronted, well, as I often do with the people I work with, we can do that down the line when the time is right, when you're ready.
Yeah. Yeah. So, sometimes I'm talking with leaders who, they're right in the thick of it. They've already started to address things and conflicts blown up, and they just don't feel safe
Yeah.
anymore. Should they still slow down and do that trauma work themselves, or is it necessary to step out of that relationship, to leave that position for a while so that they can do the work? Does one come
Yeah,
before the other?
yeah, not necessarily. And I mean, I think I I'm careful to tell people to just step out immediately because, as you know, I mean that has a cost too,
Yeah.
and sometimes there's a greater trauma putting your family, yourself in a situation where you're not getting a paycheck, you're jobless, you may need to move someplace else, and so I think if there's a way to stay in it, and this is the tough part, right? Because you don't want someone to stay in an abusive relationship,
Yeah. Right.
right? And so I need to do some assessment. Like if it's the kind of relationship where it's daily like damaging to a person,
Mhm.
then we're going to try to find a way, just like I do in a marital relationship, for them to step out. But if they can manage to sort of stay in that and monitor their own autonomic nervous system, their own reactivity, um, and come to a place where they can well make a choice. Okay, maybe that choice is I want to leave, or maybe that choice is there are several other people here who want to sound the alarm, and I think I'd like to participate with three other colleagues to sound that alarm. Or I want to sit down and have a conversation with, and people have done this, or I want to sit down and have that conversation myself, maybe with another leader, and to confront the senior pastor. Well, that's something that comes out of really thoughtful, slow engagement with someone like you, someone like me, those of us who are going to slow the train way down and get people paying attention to what's going on within them.
So, what would be an example of a situation where you would say, get out now?
Yeah, so I've seen some pretty drastic situations, and even then, I'm fairly slow to say get out now. But there are times where a senior pastor holds so much power that there's a palpable threat. I'm
Yeah.
not talking about a threat to someone's life, but where there's a maybe palpable threat to someone's reputation, or where it's incredibly unhealthy for them. Maybe there are some pre-existing sort of mental health conditions or something like that, where it's just unsafe for them to stay in that kind of role. I was working with a young pastor, and I'll make sure this is not a this is a composite, okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that there's not someone out there saying he's talking about me, but
Yeah.
but this is a scenario that I've seen where particularly young, sensitive pastor working for a somewhat sinister senior leader, where it's daily walking through those doors every day costs so much to that person's nervous system
Mhm.
that that there are maybe other behaviors that they're engaging in, maybe some kind of addiction, alcohol addiction, or maybe they've become maybe there's some suicidal ideation there or something like that, right? Where it's important to me for that person's safety to get out, and for us to find some sort of plan for them to get safe.
Yes.
And
Okay.
it really is in some ways analogous to what I'll do in marital situations where a spouse is unsafe. Like
Mhm.
we need to get you to a place where you're not going to harm yourself, where you can your autonomic system can begin to slow down and rest and regulate. That's maybe a little bit more rare,
Mhm.
but there are situations like that for sure.
Yeah, I've had situations where the leader will say to me, "This is really damaging my marriage. My
Mm,
wife is having trouble, or my husband's having trouble with the way I'm at home, and we need to fix this issue first
yeah,
um, before anything else."
that's
So
right.
sometimes some of the leaders that I've talked to have actually started to do the work. You know, they've been in therapy for quite a long time. They're doing good soul care.
Yeah,
They're coming to these conversations, you know, really well differentiated, and
Yeah.
with a calm spirit, and things still blow up in their faces. What do you do then?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about that is there are things that happen to you. There are things that you can't control around you, right? But what you can do is pay attention to what's happening within you. And so that's what we have. We have our own capacity to differentiate, to self-regulate, and to make a decision, to step away, to set a boundary. I think that when you're dealing in situations like this, part of what activates someone's nervous system is just the inconsistency, the irregularity, the chaos of the system, and so yeah, it's interesting because I talk to a lot of people who are like, "What can I do?" and they want to sort of rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic, right?
Yeah, right.
And and in a sense, what I'm saying is save yourself, like, and I don't mean that in a selfish way, but I mean that in a, like, you've whatever it takes for you to survive and be well, to live another day, and I do wish someone would have said that to me years ago. I remember in the situation that I was in, there are particular people, including a therapist in my life, who was sort of egging me on, like, "Oh, you can do it. You have what it takes to, maybe you'll be the first person to confront this pastor," who are not at all attuned to what was going on within me. They were thinking, "Oh, Chuck DeGroat might be the guy to finally change what's happening at that particular church. He'll be the staff member to finally kind of do," and I was 32 years old, and so I do wish I had someone looking out for me a long time ago, saying, "You know what, Chuck? You're hurting. You're in pain. You're overwhelmed. You're lonely. And I sense that you're in a lot of activation. And so let's just find a way for you to kind of move out in a way that blesses him and blesses you." And but I just didn't have that. Yeah. What about you? Have you experienced anything like that?
Oh man, there's so many things that I learned through my recovery and burnout. It's just about how much help I needed in just noticing what's going on in me.
Yeah.
And so having somebody alongside you to help with that is really, really key. I think kind of what we're talking about is what Jesus was referring to when he said, "Take the log out of your own eye." It's not just deal with your own sin, but make sure that you're healthy, that you're well, that you can see clearly to address this situation, that your own stuff isn't getting in the way, So sometimes, now I don't want to paint the picture that all big churches are bad or anything, far from it, but there are some churches where if you're that second level leader, really it's your job to maintain the momentum of the machine, and that's what you do all the time. And as some of these leaders get healthier, they realize they don't want to be part of that machine anymore. They want a slower pace, unhurried pace, to borrow Alan Fadling's term. How would those leaders begin to move out? Because I found some of them, when they start talking about wanting this slower pace with Jesus, that's seen as a threat within these churches. And sometimes things blow up around that too, so that they're attacked, they're belittled. How do you step out in that situation?
Yeah, so that's tricky too, because I think you're exactly right. I think when you begin to talk about those kinds of things, or you introduce contemplative practices, or invite maybe elders or the senior leader to think about new ways of doing ministry, it's a threat. And one of the things I say when I teach on this is we all have nervous systems. Like, that senior pastor has one and you have one, and when he experiences threat, he goes into survival mode too. And you might be that threat, and that threat may be, "Hey, we need to slow down, practice contemplation, engage soul care practices within," things like that, right? And so, Sean, you just froze. Can you hear me?
Oh, think we just froze for a
Sean,
second.
can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I think we're
Okay.
back.
I think we're back. We'll edit that out.
We just slowed down. That's okay.
Yeah.
It's important to slow down sometimes, and I think that's even an example right there of in those kinds of ministry situations when obstacles come up, when there are things that are sort of introduced from the outside that feel chaotic or throw them into some uncertainty. These senior leaders can start to spiral a little bit.
Yeah.
They have nervous systems. You have a nervous system, so it's important to sort of recognize that might feel like a threat to him or to her too, and to understand. I think we do these things oftentimes in like principled ways, like he's principled about, we need to grow this church so that we can bless the city with other churches, that we can multiply. And you're principled with, I want to do slow church, and I've learned contemplation and silent prayer and solitude, and I'm reading a lot of Merton and Nouwen, and I want to do, and I think that there's maybe a little wisdom in both, but I want us, oftentimes in situations like that, when I'm working with a system, I'm wanting people to slow down and try to connect. I'm wanting both parties to sort of center, to do the work that they need to do to really listen to one another. And so now I'm talking a little bit more on a systems level, right? Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that within church context, within staff context, within organizations, we're human beings with stories, with pain, with fragility, right? And there are things that will animate us, activate us, stress us, that are different for each of us. So how can we move toward one another with empathy until the other person displays that they're not capable of empathy? And that's when you're probably dealing with someone on the narcissistic spectrum.
Yeah. So there are times where we need to approach with humility, with gentleness,
Yes.
recognizing that they're probably going to be triggered or activated at first, and we need to provide some safety and come back to this very slowly and carefully so that they know we're not against them necessarily, but this change might be for everybody's good. So what about
so just on that,
go ahead.
Just to be clear, because people will disagree with me on this, but a narcissist is not a monster, nor is a narcissist evil, like as in, through and through. A narcissist is an image bearer, but a narcissist is, let's say it's a male, it's a little boy under threat. And under threat, people can look very big, very bad, very dangerous, porcupined out, swords out, and that's really scary. But as I've done the work over the years, the only way that I can sit with these men, primarily men, I used to see them as monsters, and so I used to be pretty scared, and sitting in my chair, oftentimes as the therapist, like, what if he hurts me? Now I see them as little boys who are scared, who are armored up, and so we humanize the work.
Yeah, they're like David in Saul's armor. It just doesn't fit, but they're trying to make it work. Yeah. So sometimes people are really at the beginning of this process. They're just learning. Man, I've really been wounded over the years, and I recommend to them, you really need to find a good trauma therapist. But they don't know how to do that. How does somebody find a good trauma therapist? What do they look for in a therapist to be able to begin to do this work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's challenging too, because just because someone says trauma informed doesn't necessarily mean that they know how to do the work, and engage the work of the autonomic nervous system, or that they have the kinds of specializations that some have, whether that be in EMDR or brain spotting or deep brain reprocessing or all the somatic experiencing, all the different kinds of modalities out there, internal family systems. So I think it's really important to interview therapists, to go in for your first session, in a sense, as a test session, What kind of trauma have you worked with? Have you ever worked with someone in ministry who's dealt with
Mhm.
abusive leadership? Ask kind of pointed questions. Have you ever dealt with someone like me? Maybe they say, no, I've never really dealt with someone like that. I mostly deal with traumatized war veterans, or I deal with children who are adopted, or might not be the right therapist for you. So do an interview, but then trust your gut. If you're 6 sessions in and it just doesn't feel like it's helpful, it's okay to fire your therapist. I've been fired. It's okay to say, hey, I just don't think it's working between us. I'd really like to see someone else, and then end the relationship. It's on the surface, it's a transactional relationship. Now, every therapist, every one of us who does the work will tell you it's much more than that, especially when
Mhm.
we get into the work. It's a trusted relationship, right? But if I'm going to be paying 125, 150, in some case, I just found out there's someone with half the experience I have charging $250 an hour. But
Oh.
um, people are charging a lot of money for therapy these days. Don't keep giving your money away if it's not working for you,
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it can take a few sessions, and you should find somebody that helps you to feel heard and seen and
Yes.
known,
Yeah.
somebody that you can trust. If that stuff isn't there, the rest really doesn't matter, right? There needs to be
Yeah.
some sort of
Yeah.
relational connection. Now, you don't have to be best friends with your therapist or something like that, but
Mhm.
um, that
Yeah.
basic trust has to be there, and that
Yeah.
takes time to develop, right?
Yeah. 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 It does take time to develop, and don't base it on shows like Shrinking or other,
Yeah, yeah.
but I think what you just named is so important. Someone who sees you, someone who you feel safe with, someone who listens well. That's something that, this is why I say trust your gut, trust your body, because your body tells you. So your body's got a radar system. It's called neuroception, and your body tells you, hey, this person's safe. This
Mhm.
person is okay to be with. You can tell your story here. And so if you listen within, and by the way, in Christian circles, what I just said in some Christian circles is heresy. Trust your body, trust
Yeah.
your feelings. Um, but what we know is that our body, if we listen well, if we learn to listen well, will tell us this person is safe, this person isn't safe. And it's most of the time the people who have not trusted their bodily intuition, who stayed at the church with the abusive narcissistic pastor for 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about that a little bit. You talked about the idea of approaching this issue slowly, making
Mhm.
sure you're doing your own work. Um, can we put a time frame on it? How long does this process take to be able
Yeah.
to really address this? I know you can't say, well, it's going to take you 2 weeks or
Yeah.
2 years exactly, but this isn't something that's a quick fix. So it's
That's
going to
right.
take some time.
Yeah, and some of that depends on your story. It's not so much the situation, but your story, your body, what you're bringing. I I oftentimes say that as I began to, probably now 6, 7, 8 years after I was fired, and I began to really do my own work in earnest. I realized at first, I was laser focused on what happened to me in 2003, but I began to see that it was caught up in a larger story of trauma, and that my trauma was cumulative or compounding, over
Yeah.
the course of years. Uh, it's the difference between maybe a one-off situation where you're fairly resilient. That bad thing just happened to you, but you're basically secure and you've been well attached to your parents and you've got good relationships, and within 6 weeks or 2 months or 6 months even, you're back on your feet and you're feeling good, and you're not having a hard time trusting, and you're not mad at every church in town, versus the person who, this the particular experience they just had at the church, under that senior pastor, is caught up in a much larger matrix of trauma
Mhm.
in one's life. And there, we're talking at times about complex trauma. We're talking about trauma that, um, we're most would say, you might be doing therapy for years. That doesn't mean every week over the course of years, but it might take much longer
Mhm.
for you to get to that place where you can engage more resiliently. And so it's hard to put, it's not, again, not so much about what happened. Two people can go through the same exact situation at a particular church, and one is resilient within a month, and the other one is after a year seeing the same therapist still struggling.
Yeah, because we bring our own baggage into it.
Yeah.
It's really our past, our history, our family. It's all involved
Yes.
in that.
Yeah.
So if someone says, "All right, I recognize I need to do this work," are there certain landmarks along the way? So, for example, if you're in that survival mode, probably the first thing that we need to work toward is just getting you to feel safe again, to
Yeah.
feel secure. Are there certain landmarks to look for toward healing?
Yeah. Well, I think you will grow as you shift from that kind of activated, what we call sympathetic nervous system state, what I call storm, that
Hmm.
constant storm within, to home base, to center, to a place of calm and connection. Um, uh, as you begin to intuit a sense of safety, as you begin to feel like you're back in your own body, as you feel more connected to your emotions, as you feel like you have more agency, like in other words, you can make choices. You're not caught up in ambivalence or uncertainty or indecisiveness. All signs of trauma, by the way. Um, those are some of the signs that we begin to see. As someone will say to me, I walk back into church and I just don't feel the same anxious activation that I felt, 2 years ago. I feel safer. I feel like if I needed to step away, I could step away and I wouldn't be kind of stuck, whereas some people will tell you kind of early on in a journey around their trauma, church trauma, like, I don't know if I went back, I'm not confident that I'd be able to make the best decision for myself to get out. Right. So
Yeah.
those are some of the signs we see that that begin to tell me, yeah, I think there's some resilience. I think you're living from, I call that place home. In other words, home in God, home in your own body, a place that feels safe, where you feel secure, held, known by God, loved. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey,
I
do I
think,
get to ask questions too, by the
yeah,
way?
yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
Yeah,
shoot.
I mean, I think it'd be fun to turn the tables
All
here,
right, go ahead.
because I'm sitting here thinking, I have had a question for you for a while that I think I have a way of thinking about, but I don't know that it's so helpful. But you've done all this work on burnout over the years,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
if someone came to me and said, "Oh, so what's the difference between burnout and trauma? How do I know I'm in burnout versus whether or not I'm in trauma?" What's your answer to that?
Yeah. Well, often it's a really blurry line, um, because so many people who think they're in burnout are actually just experiencing trauma.
Hmm.
They're really needing much deeper work, than what I can give them. So I usually focus on, if you can name the source, if you can name really where it happened, what's leading to this burnout, and usually it's going to be workplace related stress of some kind. It's
Hmm.
not a major wound, although it may be small wounds over a long period of time that build up to a major wound.
Yeah.
It's usually not, one big thing that you can point to. It's a slow slide, and usually it involves more of a violation of our own values,
Hmm.
and falling into people pleasing, and relational conflict is often involved. But it's from what I can see, it's usually not major traumatic events.
Hmm.
It's not abusive,
Yeah.
although sometimes church boards or church leaders can feel abusive, when we're just not in good
Yeah.
harmony with one another.
Yeah.
But that's really what I focus on is what's the story
Yeah.
behind it.
When do you know when you're dealing with folks who are burned out? When do you have a sense that I need to maybe send them to a trauma therapist? What's the clue or the cue to you that you need to do that?
It's after usually lots of questions. I usually ask some basic questions around burnout just to see if there's that level of fatigue, the depersonalization that people experience in burnout. But then often they start to tell stories of childhood wounds, family of origin issues,
Mm.
um, things that are popping up from their past in their current relationships. That's a sign to me that there's a deeper work that needs to be done there. And I'm willing to listen, but I tell them that I'm not a therapist, and so I'm not going to be able to help you
Yeah.
through this. I probably could help them a little bit, but I don't want to do more damage. So that's where I say coaching with me and seeing a therapist at the same time is a really powerful combination.
Yeah.
And those who are willing to do both or have the ability to do both really thrive.
Yeah. Do you ever see it where someone is so um, like maybe not cued into or clued into what's happening within them, that that they come to you and they say, well, I'm suffering under a narcissistic abuser, and they're using that kind of language, and you sort of determine, no, you're just burned out. I mean, your pastor may not be a great leader, but I think you're just burned out. Does that happen?
Yeah, it does happen. It's often in somebody who's been burned out for quite a while, and
Mm.
now the people around them are starting to see it and starting to talk about their performance, and it's starting to feel heavily critical because
Yeah.
they have fallen off quite a bit.
Mm.
Um, I think usually when somebody comes to me and says I'm working under a narcissistic leader, I say, tell me about that leader and the relationship. What is it that says this person's narcissistic or controlling or abusive
Mm.
to you? And unless I hear some real intense abusive language, I'm hesitant to call it narcissism.
Mm.
And they're going to use the language either way. It's just kind
Yeah.
of part of our
Yeah.
culture.
Yeah.
But I always say we can only work with you. I can't help you change somebody else.
Yeah.
So you're the one who can work with you, and we'll just figure out what is within your power to change,
Yeah.
and start with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think this is where your book is so helpful, because I do think, we've got much more access, because we've been around for a little while, we weren't using these psychological terms in the church 20 years ago, right?
Yeah,
And so we've got
right.
much more access to them now. And so people are quick to name things as narcissism, abuse, or trauma, or whatever the case may be, which very well may be so. But I think to have a guide like yours to help people sort of self-diagnose, in a sense, to say, yeah, this actually is burnout. It is work-related. I don't think it's
Mhm.
caught up in a larger story of deeper wounds. So helpful.
Yeah, I have had a number of people come to me and say I'm burned out, and when we talk about it, there's actually other mental health issues going on
Mm.
that really need to be addressed, and it's not because they're in an abusive system. They may have ADHD, or have been diagnosed with other mental health things that are really driving what's going on. And then in those situations, I just say that this isn't something I can help with.
Yeah.
I'm just not
Yeah.
trained in those areas.
Yeah.
So figuring out, is it really work-related stress, and is it really their inability to manage that stress? That's the issue, because that's really at the heart of what burnout is.
Yeah. That's really good. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, thanks for that. That's really helpful. I think it's probably, for people who are tuned in right now too, maybe just helpful to kind of make those distinctions, right?
yeah,
So,
yeah. Hopefully.
yeah.
So let's just end with, what does health look like for these leaders, whether they're burned out, whether they're in working under a narcissistic leader, or they've left and now they don't want to end up in the same situation again, because I've seen that happen. What does it look like for them to be healthy, and what does a healthy culture look like, or a healthy leader look like to work under?
Well, I mean, I think healthy leaders are curious and humble first. I mean, they're curious about their impact. They're curious about how they show up. They're very, very willing, and this is where humility comes in, very, very willing to hear from others within the organization, others that report to them, how they're impacted. They're just not afraid of those conversations. Someone comes to them and says, the conversation last week was a little off-putting, or I felt dismissed by you in the staff meeting. Healthy leaders are not quick to the draw, not quick to react. But now all of us have some reactivity. All of us have nervous systems. All of us, when we perceive threat. But I think by and large, you're on your way to being that leader who shows up with humility and curiosity. In part, that's because you have done your own work, as we've talked about. In other words, there's some old language that goes all the way back to St. Augustine here in the 10th chapter of the Confessions, where he says, let me know myself, let me know you, O Lord. Noverum me, noverum te. He just spent 9 chapters telling his own story. And I think that there's an example there in church history of, do we know ourselves? Do we know our own stories? And so when you know yourself, when you know yourself well enough to know how people and situations impact you in a variety of ways, well, then when it comes, you may be less apt to react, because you've experienced that before. You've gotten critical feedback before. You've had someone say no to you before. When we haven't done our work, we tend to be more abrasive. We tend to be more reactive, right? And so healthy individuals have done that work. They're curious, they're humble, and healthy systems have an expression of that kind of freedom more collectively. Healthy systems are curious, they're playful, they're creative, they're connected, people are compassionate. You know it when you see it. When I walk in and do some organizational work, I'm invited to do some sort of retreat or Enneagram thing or assessment or whatever it is. Boy, I can walk into a room and just almost feel it right away, the kind of the thick walls of anxiety around people, or the playfulness. And when I talk about playfulness, I'm not talking about like the joking of an anxious system, because I see a lot of that, like it's anxious joking, or this isn't going to be too hard, doc. You're not going to ask too many hard questions, are you? That kind of nervous,
Yeah.
But really a kind of delightful playfulness. I remember doing that kind of work with a church in Northern California, where I walked in, and in the site that they had chosen, the place that they had chosen, the way that they had arranged our time together told me, you are people who know how to rest. I'm not coming here to, I'm not going to have to do a lot of heavy lifting here. And in fact, I might just be able to point out some of the beautiful things that I'm seeing with you and among you. But it was interesting. They were asking me to come in and do some assessment. And by the end, I said, thank you for asking me to come in. You guys are the picture of health, So yeah.
Well, that's nice to hear.
Yeah, right? It happens. There are healthy pastors and healthy systems. They're out there. Yeah.
I think one of the keys is just that sense of relaxed environment. It's not an environment that's filled with tension. Also, I find that leaders who are healthy are interested in developing the leaders around them. They're not going to so much fit them into their system and make them, square peg in a round hole or something like that. Yeah. But they're gonna develop the work around the person, around their gifts, around their abilities, their story, their experience. They're going to be interested in all those things and recognize that leaders thrive when they live out of who they are, rather than just a task to complete.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
one of the other things that I find in a healthy leader and a healthy system is they're clear.
Mm.
They have a real sense of where the boundaries are. And as long as you stay within these boundaries, you have complete freedom. And if you get outside the boundaries, here's the penalties. Maybe there's a margin there, but
Yeah.
there's just a sense of, I know exactly what I'm expected to do and how I'm expected to do it and what freedom I have around those
Mhm.
questions.
Yeah.
That to me is one of the key signs.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. Have you experienced systems like that where you go in and you're like, what? Here it is. There's freedom, there's clarity, there's creativity, there's playfulness.
Only where I work now.
Well,
This
that's
is
good to
this
know.
this is the first time working in PIR. This is the first time I've really experienced the clarity and the freedom to do that, um,
Mm.
and the freedom to ask for more clarity.
Mm.
There have been times in other places where I asked for that, and um, there was just no way of getting to that space
Yeah.
with the leaders I was working with.
Yeah. 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 Well,
There was
I
actually a
appreciate what you do.
resistance to clarity because then they could maintain control
Yeah.
um, by keeping things unclear.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate what you do in the space that you're in. And I've sent some people your way over time, and that space that you provide for pastors, particularly who are in season of some significant confusion,
Yeah.
and the way you can sort of hold their hand through the wilderness, of confusion, and help them. Well, whether that's making a choice to see a therapist or processing some things with you, or going to another spiritual director of some kind, or whatever it
Mhm.
is, and the clarity you've provided, even with the book on burnout.
Well, thanks, Chuck. And like I said, I always appreciate your work. Your books, Wholeheartedness, I think, is one of the most important books out there. When Narcissism Comes to Church is a really helpful diagnostic type book. Um, uh,
I thought you were going to say it's the best book on narcissism in the whole wide world.
if
That
I
would
had
be
read them all, I might say that. I don't know, but
that would
it,
just
it
be fitting.
it is excellent. And so, yeah, I'm really thankful for you, and thanks for taking the time to have this conversation. I hope it's
Yeah.
helpful to leaders who find themselves in these spaces.
Yeah. Thanks.
At PIR Ministries, we partner with God and the church in the work of pastoral renewal and restoration to cultivate new hope for healthy ministry lives. We offer assessments, coaching, and other resources. You can learn more about how we can help you at pirministries.org. At PIR, we want you to know we are here so you don't have to walk through hard ministry transitions alone. You can reach us at info@pirministries.org. If you want to learn more about Chuck and his books and his counseling work and his soul care intensives, you can find more information at chuckdegroat.net. Finally, if you'd like to connect with me or learn more about what I offer, please visit SeanNemecek.com. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you found it helpful.